My name's Torrin Douglas, and I would usually be chairing some of the WorkTech events on London's South Bank and in other large halls. And today we're delighted to welcome Bruce Daisley. Bruce is a former VP at Twitter and the author of Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, 30 Hacks for Bringing Joy to Your Job. He was previously Twitter's vice president across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. He joined the company in 2012, having previously run YouTube UK at Google. His passion for improving work life led to him creating the podcast Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat on making work better. And the subject of our discussion today is life after lockdown, good work and employee well-being. So Bruce, to start, it's been, to say the least, an interesting time for us all in the past few weeks, and not least of all business. We've seen work culture massively disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. But let's start by going back a bit to the way we were. Before we were hit by COVID-19, what were the key issues leaders were experiencing today when it comes to the workplace?
Yeah, I think probably if we'd have taken stock at the middle of last year or the end of last year, probably the big themes that most teams, workplaces, leaders were thinking about were levels of burnout, and principally because we were just starting to see a growing phenomenon. The organizations that measure workplace experience and workplace culture generally have seen a gradual increase in burnout. And it's really interesting. It wasn't just reserved to office work. We were seeing it amongst school teachers. We were seeing it amongst health workers. So I think it was a big indication that we were just working more. And probably to some extent, that is a reflection of just the way that work has become so mobile, so easy to do. It's led to two things. It's led to us thinking ourselves that we should be connected more, but it's also led to an expectation from our employers and our customers that we should stay online. I think one survey in the US said that if your boss expected you to stay connected, you were clocking up about 70 hours a week of workplace connectivity. So it's just a massive amount, a massive volume of us staying connected to our jobs pretty much from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep.
And so that was changing the whole culture. And you'd been at Twitter, which had a really good work culture. You actually congratulated yourself on it and said, oh, we've got this great. And then, of course, you started to have to change things because the economy didn't go so well. How did all that happen?
Yeah, well, broadly, the reason why I got interested in this is that I was, really from every time I've worked in organizations, I've always been enchanted. Maybe when you'd go and see another company and you could get a sense just from the interactions between people, between the sort of the warmth of communication between people, whether they were good places to work or not. It's like fascinating how much we communicate. Similarly, in the same way that when I used to work in restaurants, when I was sort of paying my way through college, you could tell pretty quickly what your experience was like. But actually a lot of that is communicated when you dine in those places. You can sense whether there's a good mojo or a bad mojo. So I was always interested in that. And I think a combination of economic events and a couple of personal missteps meant that our culture went wrong at Twitter. And I just became really interested. How could any of us set about correcting it? Is it something that you could buy the manual and you could improve your workplace dynamics? Is it something more specific than that? Was it something that you could never pinpoint? And so that was how I got into that. And the revelation for me was that there's so much work done by organizational psychologists. There's so much work done by people who really study all manner of different ways that work impacts us and the way that we interact with our colleagues. And yet so little of it was reaching people in jobs. You occasionally get a bit of a Guardian article, a Telegraph article here or there saying, oh, this is the latest trend. But so little of it actually, in terms of the behaviors that we need to adopt, the psychology, so little of it was reaching people. And I think that was my own curiosity, really.
So your first book, was that The Joy of Work?
Yeah, it's the same book, really. The only difference is I published it in the US under a different title, and it involved me taking out references to Blackadder and E17. But it's the same book.
Yeah. And what did you find when you were creating that? What were the revelations to you?
Yeah, well, the big thing for me was that there's so much work done. So, the day that I discovered, this is going to seem like a trip down memory lane, but the day I discovered how deeply unproductive open plan offices were was this sort of paving slab in the face, really, because I was just astonished, because every office you go to, every company you visit, we're all in open plan offices. And so when I discovered that open plan offices lead to an increase in an increase in emails by 75%, face-to-face conversations go down by 2/3. It's sort of, it was baffling for me, because I was like, oh, really? Well, why are we sort of moving? Well, why have we collectively moved to this form of office configuration when it just works so ineffectively? So I think, there was a series of revelations like that. One of the things that I was most taken with is that there's just learning and knowledge everywhere. There's one professor from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a guy called Sandy Pentland, and he did a really interesting experiment where he sort of tracked what really went on in offices, almost like one of those time-lapse things that you might observe, just watching people, but with big data, who spoke to who in the office, what happened. And he set about sort of tracking it. And he was like, okay, well, this is really interesting. Meetings don't seem to account for, the volume of meetings doesn't seem to account for meetings, for offices being more productive. In fact, one of the things, I was just revisiting his work over the weekend, and one of the things that he said is that he discovered that meetings were deeply inefficient. And what he discovered was that it was the face-to-face chat after meetings that seemed to be incredibly powerful. And the reason why is because bosses weren't in the room. That you or I might be working for some monstrous boss who instructs us something that, collectively we roll our eyes thinking, well, that will never work. I slink over to your desk afterwards saying, Torin, how are we going to make this work? And you and I collectively solve the problem. And he discovered he was able to actually observe that in the data, which immediately then sort of begs the question, as we'll go on and transition and think about the new world of work, actually those little chats by the coffee machine, those little chats by the lift, those chats sort of as we're waiting to use the loo or whatever, those chats are going to disappear. And it's interesting, if they were the sticking plaster that was holding the old configuration of work together, begs the question, how are we going to replace them, really?
Absolutely, and we will move on to the current the current situation, the fact that when you're on Zoom, you can't do the sort of little side bits afterwards and so on. But you then, having done the book, you started a podcast.
Yeah, and they were sort of the order was sort of adjacent, really, but it was just a process of self-learning. And I've been thrilled to speak to people like Seth Godin. Adam Grant is probably the world's leading organizational psychologist. About 3 weeks ago, I spoke to a woman called Frances Fry, and Frances Fry has sort of developed a reputation as being the John Harvey Jones of her day, of internationally. She goes into firms that are, their culture's just in this toxic waste zone. So she'll go into companies like WeWork, or she's going to companies like Uber that are finding themselves in the news for the wrong reasons, and she sets about trying to solve them. So it's just fascinating to chat to people like that. Really, I'm interested in the specifics of it. You walk into Uber, it's in the midst of this front page news in every country in the world. Susan Fowler, a 26-year-old product manager, has written this blog post saying that pretty much she was working in a dating culture where it it seemed like her office was filled with people trying to slip into each other's direct messages. And she described the impact that had on her career. And then the woman I chatted to, Frances Fry, Professor Frances Fry, has to go into those companies and solve it. And I was interested. Where do you start? Where do you start in a situation like that? So that's it. Across 100 episodes, I've been fortunate to speak to probably the leading people who are trying to solve this work culture problem.
And how many of those lessons do you think will translate into this new world? I mean, how has life changed in the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think, I was listening to something the other day, and they were asking, they asked Ernest Hemingway how he went bankrupt. And he said, slowly, then suddenly. And I think, that's where we are right now, that, people initially, when we went into lockdown, people probably weren't deliberate enough about clearing their desks. There's probably across offices across the world, these desk plants that unfortunately have perished in the last few weeks, because we thought that this was like a brief little excursion. It was like a fire drill at school, that you were being sent home, but it was very much a passing phase. And I think what's become gradually evident for us is that, firstly, this lockdown is almost certainly going to continue in some form for probably the next year and a half. The tragedy that is unfolding before our very eyes is that for the first time today, they talked about maybe the Tokyo Olympics won't be happening, which truly heartbreaking. It's one of my favorite acts of humanity. But Cambridge University has already called the shots and said there'll be no in-person lessons next year, the whole of next year. So that's projecting 13 months from where we are. And I think we're in this gradual game that almost seems like a game of chicken. Google and Facebook announced that people wouldn't be going back till Christmas. Twitter announced, my old employers announced, that people, if they didn't want to go back, could go back never. And I think we're in this zone. But I think the reason why it's starting to have an impact, and we realize this is bigger than we imagined, is because we're starting to see little ripples in the pond that go beyond that. So the chief executive of Morgan Stanley said that he was always a lifelong avoider of remote work, and he's done a 180 on it in the last 2 weeks. A friend of mine works at a very big media publication, world-renowned brand. He said they have 1,400 people going into their building every day in normal order. He said in the last 8 weeks, they've had 30 people going in. And he said, if you don't think the world has changed, you are bananas. And anyone who follows the world of publishing has witnessed job cuts after job cuts over the last week and a half, really. BuzzFeed, The Atlantic today. There's no shortage of publications who are cutting costs. And, the only difference between the publishing business and so many other businesses is that businesses around the world in the next year are going to be in the midst of the worst depression that any of us are going to witness. American unemployment hit about 32 million today, I think. It's, we're going to go into something that's going to make the Great Depression be the only decent comparison. And the idea that firms won't be looking to economize on costs, I think, is fanciful. So, we're going to go into this zone where very quickly the norm, the new version of work is not a temporary thing, at least till the end of this year, maybe till the middle of next year, maybe till the end of next year. We're going to be looking at different ways to work. By then, I suspect that remote working will be just so ingrained into our culture, so ingrained into whether our company can succeed or fail, that actually, unless you've worked out how you can succeed remotely by the end of next year, I suspect you'll have met a perilous outcome, and it fundamentally causes a rewiring then. So if the economics of this mean that we need to focus on it, if the medium-term imperatives mean we need to focus on it, I think the critical thing is that we're not going back to the way we were working.
So what's going to happen to all these office buildings, these great big towers in Manhattan and in London and so on? What's going to happen to them?
It raises such a massive point, doesn't it? Because two things. Firstly, well, these I sort of listed a few, but the Barclays CEO said the idea of summoning 7,000 people into one building seems archaic. The boss of Morgan Stanley says, the boss of Nielsen, so a research company, he said, we're probably looking at something like having meeting rooms where teams come and meet and customers come and meet, but then people mainly work at home. And it's and, firms are just going to realize very quickly. I was chatting to a drinks brand who said, we've realized actually we're getting more done in this new world. And it begs the question why we need an office. There's going to be no shortage of this. So then, well, what's the solution? There's going to be a vast oversupply of commercial office space. The really interesting thing, if you want to look at it sort of from a system thinking point of view, is the biggest leaser of office space in Manhattan and in London is WeWork. And WeWork is obviously in something of a perilous state itself. They claim that they collected 80% of their rent in April, and I think the suggestion is that probably will be the high watermark for the next few months. And WeWork, anyone who's been following the news, and people will know that WeWork's in something of a perilous financial state. Its main backer, SoftBank, has pulled out of sort of a major funding deal. So it's very, very highly likely that in addition to the situation that we've witnessed where most companies who are coming up for renegotiation of their space will maybe say, we need half of the space that we've currently got. But in addition, WeWork maybe will wipe out 10% of the market as well. So it's a perilous state. Question immediately becomes, what can the people who own that space do with it? And of course, the first thing you might suggest is maybe they'll flip it to loft living, and they'll flip it to accommodation. So look, maybe the cities we're living in or that we're working in will transform, and people in their 20s and 30s who till now have been choked out of the property market, maybe they're about to find that they can live just above their favorite bars and restaurants in town for just extraordinarily cheap prices. So who knows? I think it's such a system shock that no doubt there's a few more twists. I don't bet against the commercial property owners thinking, well, what can we do? Could we give people, is there a re-leveling of prices, but we try to keep these all occupied and we add more services? Or is there something we can do to give people a year rent free? But raises really big questions.
So that was the first silver lining, that maybe people are going to be able to live in these lots. We were already seeing the decimation of the high street. So that was one thing that was happening pre-COVID-19. Now we seem to be losing both. So I mean, property everywhere seems to be not something you want to be into.
Yeah, and it just raises big questions. Let's think specifically. The Barclays CEO there said the idea of bringing 7,000 people into a building might be a thing of the past. Well, anyone who's been into Barclays headquarters or HSBCs or any of the sort of the big bank offices down in Canary Wharf, it doesn't immediately present itself as obvious how you could flip a couple of those floors into commercial property. You know, they've got into residential property. They share lifts with each other. You know, the security implications of having residential below sort of banking obviously is pretty big change. So it begs the question how we're going to unpick ourselves from this, because it's going to be very big disruption. But I guess, one of the things that any British people might have admired about Manhattan or about Paris is that there's a blend of residential and business properties all throughout the cities. And it does give the city a real life to it, that, when you can live above some of these places. So, the optimist in me says that, okay, well, maybe this is a re-leveling and people can get themselves on the property ladder and find, and maybe the new rhythm of life is you live in your 20s, in your early 30s, in sort of these city centre locations, and then you go and live remotely and you work from, Devon, Lincolnshire, Scotland, when you're later and you want to sort of live a full remote life. Optimism, maybe there's some solution in that.
So what is the main thing that we are missing by not going into the same place of work? What good things happen there that we are missing?
Well, it seems like one of the biggest things that happens is the volume of connectivity, the volume of communication goes down by about 4/5. So what you discover when you look at the technology that takes place, people tend to communicate more intentionally, but less frequently. So, there might be you might send me a long 2-page email specifically going through line by line our interactions, but we don't have those sort of brief stolen words, quick chat after a meeting. We don't have those things. And it begs the question, what is the work? Is the work the specific intentional act, or is work sort of that gradual sandpapering down of an idea that you say, actually take that slide out, I've been thinking about that, I'll get back to you later on that. And it just begs the question whether work is these big specific acts, or whether it's these gradual acts. Certainly what you do discover is when people work remotely, they connect with each other less, and the channels of communication flow less frequently. So now, I think one of the interesting thought experiments for us here is if we can start from the ground up. So, mentioning there, a lot of news organizations have been shedding workers. And I guess one thing you might say is that over the last few years, news organizations have done this sort of gradual attritional warfare where they've gradually lowered to probably a more sustainable business model. And I guess it poses the question, could you have transitioned to that new world by one big change? And I guess that's where we are now, thinking about how we can make this work. Probably one of the best things we could do is look at the organizations who've been doing remote work for an eternity. And so that's principally that they are web software products. So it's things like Basecamp, who make communication and web development products, or it's people like WordPress, their parent company, Automatic. They've been doing this for a long time. And there's a lot of these companies. And what you discover when you listen to them is that they build it they wire the whole structure from scratch in a very different way. So the order that most of us have found ourselves in is that pretty much universally across UK, across the US, we spend about, in a normal order of things, we spend about 16 hours a week in meetings. These companies spend significantly less, and they tend to find less time when they're sort of locked into Microsoft Teams calls or Skype calls or Zoom calls, and they spend more time in things that probably feel more productive, but are more individual. They work on more individual projects.
And how important is the social interaction at work? The drinks after work, or the regular get-togethers and so on? That's obviously something that we're missing.
Yeah, well, back to those remote-only companies, they don't eliminate those things. In fact, there's a really interesting thing when you look at these companies. So the company that runs WordPress, Automatic, they say that to re-energize the team, to sort of put more energy in their relationships, they say, look, you're going to be working remotely for 48 weeks a year, but for 4 weeks a year, we want you to sort out your care responsibilities, your pets. We want you to sort out your children, and we want you to commit that you're going to spend 4 weeks a year in 1 week blocks together, rebuilding our relationships. And the really interesting thing for me is that, a lot of us might be sitting here right now going, well, how can anyone build relationships online? How can you build communities online? How can you build passion online? But truly, that's what the web's been doing for 20 years. And probably the things we need to be thinking about, how we're going to build winning work cultures, how we're going to create something that feels special. And for me, I would say there's a lot of parallels, but we need to start looking at what's gone before. So let's think, a lot of us are discovering that spending 16 hours a week on Zoom calls is actually exhausting, and that our boss monologuing in a sort of rather arid tone might have worked when we're in the conference room with him, but it just feels a bit dull. One of the lessons we can learn there is from YouTubers. YouTubers recognize that these straight to camera pieces work much better when you moderate your tone. There's a wonderful article on the Atlantic website a couple of years ago called the creation of YouTube tone of voice, because so many YouTubers have got this sort of exaggerated inflection and a rather performative in the way they express things. And I'm not necessarily saying that your chief exec should become like Zoella or like PewDiePie, but probably thinking about the limits of the medium and probably upping the degree of performance is not a bad thing. The other one is that, how can you build online communities? Well, look, we need to think about things like Comic-Con. We need to think about like these communities of passion. What have they done? They've often existed as message boards. They've often existed as sort of social media interactions. But then they get together, and with all these, almost this technicolor, this caffeinated explosion of energy. So, they have these big meetup cultures, this idea where they get together and these performance to it, they dress up. And I wonder if, introverts amongst the audience will be wincing at the very idea of dressing up with colleagues. But I wonder if there's a degree of that where we work in these tribes where actually, if we're going to get the most of this, we will permit people to work from Cornwall. We will permit people to work from sort of different counties around the UK, but we get together and it's those explosions of energy that really create our culture. People will be talking about in 2 or 3 years, oh wow, that company culture is incredible. They feel such affinity with each other. They feel like they get so much done. And when they get together, wow, it's like a sight to be seen. And I wonder if we start rewiring ourselves to that model now, we might find it more agreeable.
And what can managers, leaders do to help all this? Or do they not, and at what level is the management meant to be making this happen?
Yeah, I think, the critical things are that the organizations where people feel a degree of autonomy, where they feel a degree of being trusted to get their job done, seem to be producing more satisfied workers than those where bosses are just suspicious that workers aren't doing anything, so they summon them to endless video calls. And I think it's thinking about that cause and effect is really critical. Thinking about output rather than input. So many organizations, I think, initially have thought, well, we need to summon people here, we need to see them. And of course, what they're not thinking about the experience of that for the people going through it. Now, look, we're in a very singular situation now. These rooms across the country where these kids next door whose muscles are atrophying while they're watching hours of CBeebies. And so, there's no doubt this is a suboptimal situation. I can only empathize with people who are sort of in this zone where they're trying to be at least a moderately good colleague and employee, but then try and be a reasonably good parent. And so, the challenges of that not to be underestimated. But as we remove ourselves from that and go into something more normal, it generally workplaces where people feel like they can get stuff done, where they can, they feel they're trusted by their bosses rather than they need to sort of get back to digital presenteeism. And I think those things are going to be really critical. I saw one thing this week on the New York Times website, which was in the banking industry, they routinely install sort of spy software, but it's with everyone's quote unquote permission. But they install software on your computer to see what you're doing during the course of the day. And I guess in banking, maybe the origin of this was when there was fear that people might be inside trading or doing all manner of things. But I've seen, there was a New York Times article saying that some US firms are asking their employees to install this software to see they are genuinely actively engaged in their jobs, which is extraordinarily Orwellian, isn't it?
You mentioned children. I know you've been working at home with a young baby, and that must have enlivened your life more than somewhat. But what should companies be doing in regard to parents? We've got schools perhaps opening on June the 1st, perhaps not. Some will, some won't. What can companies do, and should they do, in regard to parents and how sympathetic they are to them?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the challenges of it shouldn't be underestimated. Someone said to me, I was chatting to a worker at a telecommunications firm, and he said to me, the challenge we've got is that the middle managers who don't have any care responsibilities, it might be that they don't have parents or grandparents they need to tend to, or children, aren't fully empathizing with the chaos that people who are having to go to shopping trips or look after children are having to do. These genuine twin track. And my feeling overall is that broadly we should aim to get through the intervening, pray that it's only another month, but intervening next month until some sort of degree of childcare and schools resume. And we should treat that as a survival exercise. It's what happens subsequent to that, which I think is the rebuilding of the real work cultures and the real system of work. So, I'm deeply empathetic. I've seen, I was on something a couple of days ago where people said, the gender split of this, and of course, domestic responsibilities still fall disproportionately on mums and on women. And so obviously, the burden of people trying to work and fulfill their their home responsibilities is obviously massively suboptimal.
I'm going to go to our audience for a few questions in a minute. I can see a couple already coming in, but we know that companies have been furloughing staff, and that whole system has now been extended, but it can't go on forever. There's going to be a real crunch, and we know that there are already big companies laying off lots of staff. What can you do to make that better if you can?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, this is like without parallel and without precedent. You know, I've been really impressed with the firms that when they've done layoffs, have done them elegantly. And I saw that Airbnb laid off about 17% of their workforce and, you know, let them keep their laptop, which might feel like a trivial thing. But obviously right now it's probably a decent contribution, gave them all a good settlement and, you know, relevant for the US, gave them a year's healthcare. So, you know, I think firms doing things with class and with grace is probably something that will linger long in the mind. Yeah, I mean, it's a suboptimal situation, isn't it? And the challenge, of course, is that this probably we're going to be witnessing. I was chatting to someone this week who said, you know, we're enacting a long-term 20% pay cut for all of our workers. And it's hard not to believe that some degree of that won't be the norm. So we're obviously going to be in a strange, a very strange situation where I suspect anyone keeping a job but with a pay cut will probably feel like they've lucked out, which is you know, a wretched situation for any of us to find ourselves in.
Right, I'm going to go to the first of our questions, and this one is a personal one that says, Bruce, it's Gillian Burgess. It's lovely to connect with you again. Similar to you, I've left a large organization to follow my values and authentic self. As an ambassador for the valuable 500 and driven by personal reasons, I have a mission to improve the experience of work for people with invisible disabilities, conditions, and neurodiversity, such as autistic spectrum conditions. In fact, I believe they have unique abilities and are key to creativity and innovation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks, Gillian.
Yeah, like deeply sympathetic. And I think probably it's fair to say that had we been sitting there in normal times, then, you know, we would have said that we made progress on this in 2019 and we were set to make progress on it in 2020. I do worry if it's going to fall down the agenda. There was something out in the press last week that Google have changed their diversity program. For two reasons, I think. One, because there was a feeling that it was falling under scrutiny of the US government, that, you know, it was being seen as politically biased towards left-leaning people rather than right-leaning people, which is a really sad state of affairs, really. The idea that we would consider these things to be about politics rather than about diversity. But, you know, I do fear that these things will take a step back. I've been trying to raise some money for an ecological project that was an organization that's sort of trying to produce plastic-free alternatives to products. And my experience when trying to raise money for them was that everyone I've spoken to try and sort of get some CSR funds has said, actually, look, sorry, all of our money has been retracted, all of our budgets have been retracted, we're not doing it. So I suspect, I fear that these things, as important as they really are, and I think these illustration that they're not only acts of kindness, but they seem to be a good way for firms to make themselves more resilient and more diverse in their thinking. But I do worry that they're going to slip down the agenda for the next 2 or 3 years.
And of course, so many charities are suffering very badly, and things like the London Marathon, which would have raised millions for lots of charities, all those charity shops. So all of those disadvantaged people that charities are there to help, they're all suffering, all now competing for the same money from those who at least can give something. It's not a good picture, is it?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, I think I saw, you know, there's no shortage of people who feel that things have unfortunately slipped the wrong way. And I guess, there's going to be a challenge of priorities for a lot of firms. The question, if the perennial question with strategy is, what did you choose not to do? But I suspect there's going to be a lot of things falling in the not to do column.
So we've had another question. Do you think that employers will take more responsibility for the well-being and mental health of their workers after COVID-19? We've had a lot of talk about mental health this week, but as you say, it may be less of a priority at the moment.
My feeling is there's a very good friend of mine, Professor Sir Kerry Cooper, who sort of works out of Manchester Business School, and he often uses a phrase which is the line manager lottery. And he says that so much of our experience of work is based on our personal manager. And that's where I fear that the disconnect here. So many firms talk a good job about, we want to care for mental health. And I think mental health has sort of been, a trending topic for the last 18 months. So many firms are trying to project a nice position on it. But then when it comes down to the fundamental experience of the way that they're designing work and permitting work to be shaped, anyone who finds themselves on, well, frankly, more than 2 hours of video calls a day, but when it's getting up to 3, 4, 5 hours of video calls a day, it's impossible to find that measure of working and that method of working consistent with good mental health. It's simply impossible. It's not good. We're not able for us to sort of lock our attention that fully into something and remove ourselves from the environments we're in. And so that's what I worry about. I worry that firms talk a good game on it. I mean, there's so much sort of hyperbole and spin. I remember going into one organization and they said, we practice a mindful minute. And what we do before several meetings, we have 1 minute of silence before we go into the meeting. What wonderful, brilliantly orchestrated sort of cream topping to go on top of a cupcake, but it's nonsense. It's, the idea that somehow you wash away the toxins of the rest of the working week with, scattered minute here and there of people sitting quietly. I mean, it's lovely. It's fantasy politics, but it really just doesn't have any role to play. And that's why I worry that, unless the way that we engineer work is going to be consistent with these things, then to a large extent, it becomes a lot of work culture is this as well, but it becomes marketing. It becomes, quite often I was fortunate to work in a couple of tech firms, and one of the things you discover very quickly is that there's a disconnect between the experience of work and the way it's projected. And the most obvious one I can say, and it's with love, but it's Google 20% time. Now, Google 20% time feels like it immediately makes every other organization feel dusty and old-fashioned. What's this? I'm allowed to use 1/5 of my time to do whatever the heck I want. Wow, like the unbounded autonomy, the joy of being able to shape my job. And it was only when I'd been at Google for 5 or 6 months, I said to someone, do you know what's going to happen with 20% time? And they said, oh, we don't do it. And then so I went up and I chatted to an engineer, and I said, oh, do you guys do 20% time? I was in the commercial role. I said, do you guys do 20% time? He said, oh, 20% time, we call that Saturday. And it's just like a remarkable example of how firms are very willing to, no one externally will ever go out and say, oh, 20% time doesn't exist at that company. However, everyone in the company knows it's a lie. Marissa Mayer said, she was asked on stage when she went from Google, she was employee number 20 at Google, and she went to work at Yahoo. And they said to her, will you be bringing 20% time over? And she said, the first sort of senior leadership honesty on it, she said, the lie about 20% time is that it was actually 120% time. Is that if someone wanted to make a name for themselves, they could work on whatever project they wanted in their spare time. Now, like, that is not the impression that you would get, for no shortage of articles that have written about it, no shortage of books that have referenced it. It doesn't exist. And this is quite often what we discover when we find ourselves looking at other companies' workplace cultures. We might see beautiful American campuses with people on bikes, slurping ice creams, with people cascading down neon-colored slides. all manner of running tracks on their new roofs, whatever it might be. But all of it is spin and marketing. You're looking at marketing that culture.
Yeah. And that was in the good old days.
Old
how
days.
how can leaders this is another question from the audience. How can leaders maintain or improve company culture during this time?
Really critical thing is not trying to do it the old way. So, you know, a few of us sort of were in the rhythm of we knew things that worked, and, you know, I guess, you know, going through the sort of the gears of how these things worked, there was a time and a place. The Hewlett-Packard model that for a long time people had was management by walking around, sort of going and sort of being the maitre d' of the office, going and chatting to your teams, trying to lubricate things with a bit of chit chat and conversation. You know, a lot of us Brits especially are familiar with the old thing, if in doubt, go to the pub. You know, getting people down and sort of getting a round of drinks in seemed to be a good way to boost flagging morale when things were looking bad. And I think, you know, the danger that we might have is trying to do the old things again. Really critical, I think, is trying to maintain a degree of human connection. And you know, that can often be in really... it can be in analog ways, it can be in human ways. I saw Jess Brammer, who is editor-in-chief of Huffington Post or HuffPost, and she's just gone off on maternity leave. But before she went off, she posted, "We've discovered in this new world order, one of our favorite things is our 11 o'clock meeting, where all we do is we talk about the weekend's TV and what we've done." And I guess, you know, a lot of workers who might live alone, a lot of workers who really are sort of, you know, in a degree of isolation, which is quite extreme. And just that moment of connectivity, of talking about how far you are through that latest box set, how far you are through a TV show, can be just a moment of human connection. And, you know, while we can't touch people and we can't be with people, actually that degree of humanity seems to be a really important thing. So I've loved seeing firms that have done quizzes or have done sort of, you know, movie nights together, that have done things that are a bit human. But sometimes it's just a question of thing. If you're a boss, it's like, hey, look, rather than a Zoom call, how about we have a chat when you're out on your morning walk tomorrow? Let's, you know, where all I'm going to do is just ask how you're coping and how you're getting on. And I think those bits of humanity seem to probably pay more dividend than we might imagine. They actually do have a good impact of making us feel connected to each other.
Thanks for that. We've got about 15 more minutes, so if anybody has got any more questions they want to ask, please do. Don't worry, I've got plenty if you don't. But here's the next one. As we witness this change to, and it says distributed working, some degree of home working, working close to home in the office, do you think the role of HR, previously CR corporate resources, has to change or evolve? Will contracts and processes change?
Yeah, I mean, look, it raises such extraordinary big questions, doesn't it? Like, one of the things that companies are nominally responsible for is the physical well-being of people. So, you know, if you work in an office in the last few years, you've had someone come round and check your desk posture and just check your screen analysis. And, you know, here's the strange thing about the world that we're moving into is that no doubt there's no shortage of chief execs in the boardroom who've got lovely home offices and have got maybe they've got themselves a charming standing desk, and they're finding this all very agreeable that they're out in the home counties on their own. And then there's no shortage of people whose experience for the last 8-9 weeks has been working lying on their bed. And, you know, begs the question of like the back problems that a generation of people are going to experience. So most definitely, I think it raises really big questions of how we're going, the experience of work, how we can develop and improve the experience of work. The really interesting thing is that if you get simplistic about it, the website Glassdoor, people might know that. So it's sort of like a place that you can leave reviews about workplaces, and you can talk about your experience there. Well, the number one thing on Glassdoor for how people decide their rating for a company is culture. worker culture. And, you know, it begs the really important question: how do you create a really good work culture when there's no workplace? How do you differentiate? Will there be people, and no doubt there will be, who will say in 12 months' time, they'll say two companies in the same industry, they'll say, this power company was extraordinary. I feel like I'm part of a family, even though I'm working from my spare room. And this one will say, I feel isolated, lonely, I can't wait to go somewhere. And it begs a really big question, because then the question posed to all of us now, and most certainly to HR teams, is how do you build that? How do you build that one where people felt like they were energized, connected, they felt like something they were passionate about, rather than this one, which is they felt just utterly sort of filled with loneliness and demotivation, really.
There's a lot of quizzing going on, I know, amongst friends and company groups to try and get people together. Have you heard of any other activities that attracted you as something that worked?
Yeah, I mean, like, there was that surge of house party, and I mean, look, you know, I think a lot of us are deeply reminded that these things just don't feel the same, and while we sort of can put a brave face on it and slurp down a second glass of Sauvignon, it just doesn't feel as good as being out and about. And, you know, that's going to be the challenge. The interesting thing, of course, is that how much of this will be generational. So you might remember sort of 10, 15 years ago, there used to be a big thing. 10 years ago, people used to say, oh, you know, there's the internet in real life. Oh, that's in real life. And of course, you know, you watch people who grew up online and they never had that distinction. It felt like they needed you to clarify exactly what you meant by this being two different realities. And I do wonder if that's going to be the norm. The companies that get this, that switch, that make their workers feel like they're not in a black and white version of the old reality, but they're in a new, fully just different version of the new reality. I suspect they will very quickly be the companies that people feel delighted to work for.
And what about, I mean, HR and so on, what about hiring and firing? Or, I mean, how should all that be tackled at the moment? Do you put everything on a freeze, or are there some jobs you really need to fill and so you keep that going? What do you need to watch out for in that circumstance?
I was really fascinated when I met one of these. I did a podcast episode with a company called Basecamp, I mentioned before, a company called Buffer, and they both work completely remotely. And it was during the course of the interview that one of the people I spoke to, a woman called Deborah Ripple, who worked at the Buffer at the time, she told me how she hired people, and the penny dropped that she was hiring people that she'd never met in real life. And, you know, I can't help but say I was taken aback. You know, so much of how we assess people is based on maybe a good thing or a bad thing, but like their physical presence, you know, things we just don't notice when we're perceiving them through a screen. And I was astonished. But I think, you know, clearly the order of things as time goes on, there will be far more likelihood that we do hire people that we've never met in real life. And I think more than ever before, it goes to show that we probably need to bridge out to the fact that for a lot of us, for a lot of companies, recruitment is an amateur process, you know, where it's a lay process where we don't really do it with any degree of skill or precision. And probably we need to get a bit more professional with the way that we do it. But yeah, absolutely, you know, it's going to feel a strange world when you've spent your whole career hiring people based on them being in a room, you know, the strength of their handshake. I mean, it's going to feel like such an extraordinary thing that people will talk about. Yeah, I didn't hire that guy because he had a soft handshake. When, you know, it'd be like, I didn't hire that guy because of his Zoom background.
And again, all those things that you ought to be checking up on and so on, is it easier in this world to make up your CV or things like that? Or is it actually, once we get into all of that working, people will be a bit more vigilant about making sure that the degree you claimed you had from Oxbridge, you actually did?
I think that'll largely be the same, but I mean, who knows? Look, you know, there's definitely, we're sort of going through the things that people have had to deal with the online full stop, right? There was for a long time, there was a whole generation of people who were scared to put their credit card details in online, and they were terrified what might happen. And, as time has gone on, we've learned little rules and little ways to try and build trust. And I suspect those things will be broadly useful learnings for us.
So we've got a comment on that home working and workstation setup from Val Noble. She said, this is surely part of a positive safety culture that is human-centered. But of course, if you're at home, it's up to you to provide your desk or whatever. The company can't look at that, and it's just not as easy for them. We've got another comment here. Company Christmas parties this year. Suggestions as unlikely to be a normal period. That's such an important social event of the calendar year for companies. So again, what would you suggest? I mean, it seems a long way off. I mean, it is a long way off, but should people already be thinking about that?
I don't know. I mean, the really interesting thing is, I don't know if you sort of recall that strange period when we were in the phony war before lockdown, and like there were a lot of conferences, and in each week there was sort of this question. I think football got cancelled, and each week there was this question. Okay, these conferences for March are being cancelled, and they were being moved into September. And of course, at the time it felt perfectly reasonable to move something 6 months and expect it to happen. Of course, now a lot of people are thinking, okay, well, is September realistic to get a group of people together? And in fact, some of the early things that got cancelled, a very, very big tech firm told me that they'd cancelled one of their events in March, not at the time because it felt perilous, but because they thought they already get a lot of bad press. And they said, if we end up with a corona case outbreak, I'm not sure we can survive the news agenda. And so, it does beg the question, if you've got a gathering of 100, 200, 300 people, and suddenly it becomes part of a news story of a super spreader causing an outbreak in Warrington, then, is that something that you want to find yourself going through? So very strange times. Certainly I would be reluctant to be placing any bookings right now because, just, who's to say what situation we'll find ourselves in?
So Val Noble has come back because I was being quite dismissive and saying there's not a lot you can do about home working and posture and the equipment. And she says, I don't agree. We've been doing virtual assessments and delivering equipment to the home. So there's obviously a new business opportunity or an opportunity for companies that were already doing that to make the most of this situation.
Shout out to Val, because I know plenty of people who haven't had that same experience. And in fact, I joined on a call the other day with someone who said, I've spent the day on this chair, the only chair I've got in the kitchen, and people have been cooking behind me all day. And there was no sense that he was being provided with kit. So I do suspect it's going to vary between your organizations, really, because certainly I've witnessed a lot of organizations that haven't done that.
Val says she works for a charity.
The good guys.
Yeah. So looking ahead, I mean, how far ahead ought we to be looking now? As you say, originally we thought it might not last that long. Now it looks a lot longer. So what is the long term? What is the short term? What would you advise companies to be doing at this stage?
The thing that's really helpful is those companies that are remote only. They say I heard a wonderful discussion. I put it in my newsletter. Actually, I do a newsletter. If anyone goes to my website, which is eatsleepworkrepeat.com, and you could subscribe. And I generally try and curate, as we're sort of working out what the new rules are. I generally try and curate there what are the lessons we're learning. But one of the things that the company WordPress, they give these 5 stages of working remotely, and the first stage they say is where you sort of you do a few things, a call from home here or there. Second stage is where you transplant what you do in the office to doing it remotely, and they say that actually it tends to be less satisfying and less productive. And then they go through the stages. I sort of lay them out in the newsletter. They go through the stages of how you evolve this. And I think the critical thing is the sooner we all realize, so let's work on that basis. It's the middle of next year we go back in any normal way where there's no social distancing, middle of next year, then you need a plan to get you through the next year and a half. And you need to start thinking, okay, so what are the components of people's jobs? If we look, simplify down, I was chatting to people at the BBC a couple of days ago, and they were like, okay, we're clear now. This person is booking interviewees for these shows, and they do this, and that's their measurable output. And actually focusing on measurable outputs rather than the meetings that people need to attend and those things, and sort of liberating people from this sort of taxation across their diaries, probably is one of the best ways to bridge into this new world, I think.
And a lot of people are just not going to have jobs, though, are they? I mean, what do they do? I mean, obviously that's going to hit their income, but as people, how do you get over that? For so many people, I'm thinking of artists, theatres, so many people.
Absolutely.
What made them tick was their work and the satisfaction. We're suddenly in a situation where that work is not there.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's. I think one of the things that was being discussed in Spain was, you know, maybe an acceleration into this idea of universal basic income, which is sort of probably too long. The 4 minutes we've got left is probably too long to go through the ins and outs of that. But the idea that you just gift everyone in society £1,500 a month or whatever it is, and just permits you to exist. And almost you save money by not having to do all the admin of means testing it, but it permits you to exist so that then a lifestyle is possible. And I think, you know, it's already been on the agenda as we're sort of plotting 10 years out and thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and robots doing some jobs. But I know that it's risen back up the agenda in Spain and in the US slightly because of like this extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. I don't have the answer. I don't know.
We've had one more question. I find myself to be more productive working from home. However, I know that work is not wholly about productivity alone. Do you think that a hybrid form of working would be an acceptable form of working, some work at the office and some at home? And is that what we're going to get used to?
It's certainly what some firms are talking about. The downside of it is this. The downside of that is that, you know, the big opportunity of remote work is that actually it could lead to national regeneration. It could lead to, you know, you could have a scheme where people are invited to be remote workers in Northern Ireland, and suddenly you sort of fill Northern Ireland with all these tech workers, office workers, people who till now couldn't do their job there. And you create like a whole new community. You invite people to go and work from parts of the country that maybe they grew up, but there've been no jobs there. Wow. And you just liberate, you re-energize whole communities of the country. You know, very easily you could see half of the jobs, the tech jobs that are in Dublin. You know, if we're sitting working out how we can build the country after Brexit, you know, the UK could say, right, we're going to bring those jobs to the UK. We're going to make it tax incentives, and we're going to let people do them from anywhere around the country. Right, immediately, there's a way to re-energize the whole economy. If you have to be within an hour's train journey of London, and you need to be, or of Manchester, or an hour's train journey of Glasgow, then what you end up being is you get all of the benefits of being remote are completely decimated by this connectivity. So maybe, and I suspect a lot of firms will do that. A lot of firms will say, we're going to have these lovely meeting rooms where we have our clients in and customers in, and we're going to give them the razzle dazzle in this lovely conference suite. And then for the rest of the week, we want you to work from your home. But I think to some extent, you're missing the opportunity of remote if you do that.
Thank you so much, Bruce. This hour has gone incredibly quickly. Thank you to you and to everyone who's been watching and sending in questions. I think we might have a virtual round of applause, which seems to be now the norm in these things. So I'm going to applaud you anyway. And do join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.